I'm Don Wallace. I'm chairman of the International Institute, and I'm in Boca Grande, Florida on my vacation, so forgive the tennis shirt. As Yona will say, this topic could not be more timely or topical or disturbing. And so I want to welcome you all. And Yona, please proceed.
Thank you very much, Professor Don Wallace. As always, we appreciate very much for many contributions to our studies for decades, as well as the support of our colleagues at the Potomac Institute, General Gray, and I just see General Gray. Welcome, and Jen, welcome to the program. And we covered over the decades, and particularly now during the pandemic, that very sadly, according to, I think, today's statistics, we had already 475 million cases globally, and over 6 million people died. And in the United States alone, nearly 80 million people were affected, and some 1 million people nearly 1 million people dead. And as Professor Don Wallace mentioned, obviously, very tragically, we had, of course, the invasion on February 24th. At that time, academically, we held a forum on state-sponsored terrorism, focusing on Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran. Now, 1 month later, on March 24th, today, we are dealing with a tragedy in the Ukraine. Obviously, the cost, the humanitarian cost, is increasing every day. Now, just one word about the focus of our event today on preventing nuclear terrorism in the Ukraine and beyond the international dimensions. Obviously, as we all know, President Putin is threatening the so-called limited nuclear battlefield, along with the seizure of Ukrainian nuclear power plant. So the key question here, can the international community prevent the escalating potential disaster and the implications for WMD challenges elsewhere? So we do have a very distinguished panel discussion, and I would like to welcome them, as I mentioned, first, of course, General Gray, and then our colleagues who participated in our forums in the past few years, and some go back decades. So the first speaker would be Honorable Guy Roberts, a former U.S. Assistant Secretary of Defense for WMD policy. Following his presentation, we are delighted to host Ambassador Zalman Shuval, the former ambassador of Israel to the United States during the George H.W. Bush and William Jefferson Clinton administrations. Following him, Dr. Peter Rudick, who is a senior foreign law specialist at the Law Library of Congress. And then our colleague from Romania, Major General Dr. Michael Unescu, who is also the president of the National School of Political and Administration Studies in Bucharest. And following him, we have our colleague from Madrid, Professor, not in doubt, Santa Maria, who is a professor of Polytechnic University in Madrid and General Secretary, Institute of Fusion, in honor of General Velarde. And following here, as a commentator, we have our distinguished colleague, Professor Rita Cowell, distinguished professor at Maryland and Johns Hopkins, as well as a senior fellow at the Potomac Institute. And as I mentioned, hopefully General Gray will have some comments later on or during the discussion. Now, I would like to also welcome those invited colleagues who are following the discussion, as well as friends. Finally, before I invite our speakers to make their presentations, I would like to make two personal comments, brief comments. First, on a very sad note, as probably everyone is aware, that the great American icon Madeleine Albright died. And obviously, as everybody knows, she was the Secretary of State and US Ambassador to the UN, and as well as a distinguished diplomat, scholar, and human rights activist. On a personal level, I considered Madeleine as a colleague that together we served and worked academically at Georgetown Center for Strategic and International Studies. And she was also a member, distinguished member of the board of the journal that I edited, the International Journal of Minority and Group Rights, beginning in 1991, and subsequently she was a distinguished member of a task force on security concerns, particularly related to Africa, with Ambassador Stu Eisenstadt and General Leslie Clark. So her contributions are really remarkable and inspiring all of us to combat dictatorships and to protect democracies. One final personal comment: as a survivor and witness of history, as well as a participant observer of history from early childhood in the 1930s to manhood, if I may, during the Second World War and the post-World War, I always struggled with two critical and key questions as puzzles for decades. First, whether nations and people will ever learn the lessons of history. And second, whether civilization will survive the brutalization, the globalizations of terrorism and war. And hopefully our distinguished panel will share with us their lifelong perspectives as practitioners, as diplomats, as scholars, as scientists, to particularly to deal at this very most dangerous security challenge in the post-World War II era. With that, I invite our colleague, Guy Roberts.
Well, thank you. Yonah, it's a pleasure to be here, although I must say it's not a pleasure to talk about the topic we're about to talk on. And I'm sure all of us have our thoughts and prayers with the Ukrainians and the really deep tragedy that is unraveling as we meet today. As you said, Yonah, on the 24th of February, with absolutely no basis in international law and in complete disregard of the principles embodied in the UN Charter, and this massive Russian armed forces that are unlawfully invading and are in the process of occupying the sovereign nation of Ukraine. This unfolding invasion of Ukraine, I believe, will have indeed far-reaching repercussions that extend way beyond a breach of international law and a violation of Ukraine's territorial integrity. And indeed, the international legal order, which all of us have fought so hard to nourish and continue, is at great risk, in my view. In addition to the blatant assault on the rule of law, Russia's actions will, I think, weaken the credibility of major power security assurances. It undermines the nuclear nonproliferation regime and dampens prospects for future disarmament, further undermining the international legal order, of which nonproliferation of nuclear materials is an enormous part, will be seen as a green light for states or their state-sponsored actors to possess and use such weapons. The threat is real and pervasive, and there are multiple opportunities today, and even more so tomorrow, for terrorist groups to acquire nuclear materials, to carry out attacks in a weakened non-proliferation legal norm environment. If you look first at the supply side, indeed, the risk of nuclear and other radioactive materials falling into the wrong hands and being used for terroristic or other criminal purposes is one of our greatest challenges. It was 30 years ago, it is now, and it will be in the future. The International Atomic Energy Agency last year received notifications of nearly 190 incidents of nuclear and other radioactive material being out of regulatory control, including some cases of trafficking and other criminal activities. Indeed, since 1993, 3,686 incidents have been reported, of which 290 involved a confirmed or likely act of trafficking or malicious use. 12 of those incidents included highly enriched uranium and 2 included plutonium. Radioactive sources continue to be reported as stolen or missing, underscoring the need to improve security measures for such sources, especially during, as we've seen in numerous cases, during transport. And again, today, the IAEA continues to receive reports of incidents involving potentially weapons usable nuclear material and high activity sources. And these cases highlight the international character of the issue of such illicit trafficking and the need for cooperative efforts to counter these threats and challenges we face globally. And interestingly, there is no worldwide database as to how many sites exist where radioactive materials, which could be used for terroristic purposes, are used or stored. So there's certainly possible available sources of radioactive materials which could be acquired to those for those opportunities, and that includes state-supported and sponsored groups. We have a legal norm against such sharing materials, and that's enshrined in the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty, in which nations abstain from developing and acquiring nuclear weapons, and in return, the 5 so-called nuclear weapon states agree to pursue eventual disarmament, and which in subsequent statements would provide negative and positive assurances that they won't use nuclear weapons against non-nuclear weapon states. And of course, more on that in a second. There are then a whole host of subordinate agreements that further restrict the spread of nuclear materials for weapons and or terroristic purposes. There are literally dozens of such prohibitions enhancing and enforcing the non-proliferation norm. For our purposes and what we're discussing today, the International Convention on the Prohibition of Acts of Nuclear Terrorism come to mind. That particular convention requires all states to establish robust and sustainable legal frameworks to counter the threat. It's in my view, it's an essential tool at the disposal of member states to strengthen their criminal justice systems and effectively prevent and combat acts of nuclear terrorism. In addition, I just might mention UN Security Council resolutions 1373 and 1540, which provide further requirements for member states to not harbor or support terrorist groups in their efforts to acquire nuclear weapons or materials. On the demand side, possibility posed by terrorists in the near future is there's a lot of demand for that in some respects. I might mention too, I've been working this issue since 1991, and back then we were very suspect of the accountability of nuclear materials in the former Soviet Union, and still today I believe it's quite possible there were diversions of fissionable material necessary for building an atomic bomb, and that remains worrisome. We also have countries that, if the political environment is right, may decide to develop nuclear weapons on their own. Germany and Japan are virtual nuclear weapon states. Taiwan had a nuclear weapons program, as did South Korea. And then we look at Saudi Arabia. They have publicly stated that if Iran acquires nuclear weapons, they will. The kingdom there plans to construct 16 nuclear power reactors over the next 20 to 25 years at a cost of $80 billion. Those could be the sources for nuclear materials for a weapon. Turkey, in 2018, President Erdogan publicly stated Turkey's interest and desire to acquire nuclear weapons. And they're in the process of building nuclear reactors. And then now we of course, have Iran. Just recently, the Arabs, including the Arab League, told the Biden administration that in their view, it is not only Iran that threatens their security, but also its terrorist proxies, including Hamas, the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, Hezbollah, and the Houthis, many of which have already expressed their desire to acquire nuclear weapons. Given Iran's nuclear capabilities, it could share a nuclear weapon or materials to one or more of these groups for an attack on the West. The Arabs are clearly worried about the financial and military aid that Iran is providing to these terrorist groups. Finally, it is astonishingly easy with which many of the necessary technologies can now be acquired from companies in the West. I'm told by some very good sources that to build a missile or a weapon of mass destruction, all you need is a credit card, a shopping list, and a personal computer. That's a big difference from when we first built nuclear weapons back in the day. So in sum, Iran's lengthy history of support for several surrogate terror organizations, the ubiquitous nature of technology that can be used for terroristic purposes, all of this poses an acute danger that rogue state terrorists will eventually attain nuclear capabilities. And further, given Russia's callous assault on the rule of law and its disregard of its legal and political commitments to the Ukraine, I believe that prospective acts of nuclear terrorism are inevitable due to the widening availability of raw weapons materials and this newfound, if I want to call it that, the lack of respect for the rule of law and international legal order. And I think the resulting proliferation that'll happen with nuclear states in violation of the non-proliferation norm. One of the most dangerous and far-reaching repercussions of Russia's invasion of Ukraine is the subversion of the NPT, arguably the most critical mutual multilateral agreement for the survival of humanity. Since its first attack on Ukraine in 2014, Russia's actions have put the logic of the treaty to prevent the spread of atomic weapons on its head, because Ukraine once possessed nuclear weapons, but gave them up when it joined the NPT in 1994. Russia renewed aggression makes it look as if the treaty's purpose, not stopping proliferation, but to keep weak countries defenseless and prey to the nuclear weapon states. Putin said as much at the start of the war when he announced that he had put his country's nuclear forces on alert and issued ominous threats to anyone daring to get in Russia's way. In the early, as I said, 1990s, Ukraine briefly possessed actually more nuclear weapons than Britain, France, and China combined. But they decided that they would be entirely free of those weapons and signed the RO and ratified the NPT as a non-nuclear state. Now, in exchange for that, Washington, Moscow, and London agreed to provide Kiev with additional security pledges, which assured Ukraine of its sovereignty, the security of its territory, and its freedom from economic and political purposes. And China and France followed suit, but as a result of that came up something called the 1994 Budapest Memorandum, which was those security guarantees. And I pulled up a copy of that, and it's just, again, to show you what it said. The Russian Federation reaffirmed their commitment to Ukraine to respect the independence and sovereignty and the existing borders of Ukraine. It also reaffirmed its obligation to refrain from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of Ukraine, and that none of their weapons will ever be used against Ukraine except in self-defense or otherwise in accordance with the Charter of the United Nations. Now, interestingly enough, they also had a treaty of friendship between Russia and Ukraine. Of course, it was violated in 2014 when Russia invaded Crimea, and the Ukrainians then terminated the treaty. But again, in that treaty itself, the high contracting parties respect each other's territorial integrity and confirm the inviolability of their common borders. The parties shall base their relations with each other on the principles of mutual respect, sovereign equality, territorial integrity, the inviolability of borders, the peaceful settlement of disputes, the non-use of force or threat of force, and so on. It's a telling that we now have a situation where Russia has grossly violated all of those agreements. Okay, so the NPT also just follow on and recalls Article 2.4 of the UN Charter that countries refrain, quote, from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state. The effect of the non-proliferation regime has so far been that the vast majority of countries have abstained from acquiring nuclear weapons. But with Russia's military and non-military attacks on Ukraine since 2014, the seizure and annexation of Ukrainian territory and the ongoing invasion, the Kremlin has put the logic of the non-proliferation regime on its head. With the nuclear weapon state's security guarantees to Ukraine so obviously worthless, it looks now as if the NPT's purpose is to provide the 5 official nuclear weapon states, which also happen to have the world's largest conventional military power, with an opportunity to extend at relatively low cost their territories. And this also would happen, of course, at the expense of smaller nations. By so obviously breaking their NPT obligations, Russia has severely, in my view, undermined worldwide faith in the plausibility of non-proliferation, severely diminished the will of individual states to participate in its pursuit, and increased the potential and temptation for additional states and non-state actors to acquire and use these nuclear weapons. Middle powers not protected by larger alliances such as NATO can, and again, what lessons can they learn? Well, there are three simple lessons here. First, it is good to have nuclear weapons, either to advance your designs on another country's territory or to deter such an attack. Second, it's not good to give your weapons away. And third, it makes little sense to rely on conventions, treaties, memoranda, assurances, and other statements, even if they are fully ratified, legally binding, and supported by the governments of the world's most powerful countries. After all, they seem to be just a mere suggestion, not really an obligation, whether they're legally binding or otherwise. And that's a lesson that Russia seems to be telling. For many countries, the lesson will be to follow a wiser policy than Kiev did when it gave away its warheads. Instead, a country's chances to stay sovereign and to keep its territory intact will be higher if it obtains and keeps nuclear weapons. Starting a new nuclear weapon program isn't easy today, but once a new and disruptive technologies, and they seem to be coming along day by day, makes it easier to develop or buy nuclear weapons, and many countries will want to get them, all the more so if they have a rapacious neighbor that already has such weapons or that they suspect of wanting to get some. For that neighbor, the lesson is that it might get a chance to grab a piece of another country lacking sufficiently deadly arms and naively trusting international law. Russian behavior in Georgia and elsewhere demonstrates again and again that it can act with impunity, with a few minor arms deliveries and economic sanctions, the worst possible reaction by outside powers, and even those sanctions are usually weak and abolished over time. What else do you need to know to find the bomb an attractive solution? Of course, with the new sanctions imposed, it remains to be seen how high the cost will be through sanctions and other measures where the costs do outweigh the benefits of acquiring such capability. Well, in addition, breaches in the matrix of international anti-smuggling custom controls and nuclear non-proliferation safeguards, along with weakened legal structures, increase the likelihood, in my view, that nuclear bomb-making materials may fall into the hands of terrorists. I fear for the international legal order and the rule of law. It is hard to imagine a more terrifying prospect than an extremist group like ISIS armed with nuclear or radiological weapons, unless it's Russia detonating a nuclear weapon in Ukraine or a NATO ally, thus ending a deterrence and our deterrence posture as we know it. Nations that honor their legal and political commitments and adhere to the rule of law can take steps to reduce these dangers posed by the threats of nuclear terrorism. We can start by reaffirming the rule of law and the importance of adhering to one's legal commitments. We can strengthen enforcement measures, and I believe that our so-called New World Order remains, in fact, strong and pervasive, despite Russia's contemptuous rejection of the very norms that have kept the peace and prevented the proliferation of nuclear weapons or use by states, their proxies, or other terrorist groups. Well, I hope I've given everyone some food for thought, and hope I've set the stage for other presentations. I'll stop there, Professor Alexander. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Guy, for your presentation. Obviously, we'll come back to many of the issues that you raised. I just want to mention that in addition, obviously, to your most recent appointment as Assistant Secretary of Defense for Nuclear, Chemical, and Bio Defense Programs, during the Trump administration, you served with great distinction at NATO, and in general, also you served as a U.S. Marine Corps officer that I recall, and judge advocate, and then of course you were able to serve the country at NATO for many years and academically. So we'll come back to you later on with during the Q&A discussion. At this point, I would like to invite Ambassador retired Zalman Shuval, as I mentioned, from Israel. As many of you know, he was a politician and diplomat. He served also a member of the Israeli parliament, the Knesset, and he represented David Ben-Gurion's Buffy state list at the time, and then the Likud party, and he served in the United States for many years during the Bush and Clinton administration. Now, we academically, we were honored to host him back in, I think it was May 2019, to discuss his important book, Jerusalem and Washington. So at that time, it was held at the International Law Institute. Now we invited him to share his views of his many years of service in the United States, Israel, and elsewhere. Ambassador Shuval.
Thank you, Yona. Should I call you Mr. Terrorism, or better not? This may be misunderstood, but thank you really for inviting me to this important conference. And I'd like to thank also the other sponsors of the event. The heading of this timely webinar is Preventing Nuclear Terrorism in Ukraine and Beyond. But if this event were held not in Washington, but in Israel or in most of the Arab world, perhaps in Turkey, it would almost certainly have read Preventing a Concrete Danger of Nuclear Terrorism by Iran and possibly others. Everything, of course, is connected, and the war in Ukraine has conveniently, I'm saying this a bit cynically, distracted attention from Iran and the negotiations in Vienna. But in today's world, considering some of the players, certainly Russia, it is always wise to expect the unexpected and to imagine the unimaginable. And some of the statements from Russia are certainly alarming, not just the statements, the deeds, of course. And a limited catastrophe can quickly become a general catastrophe, a vast one. But just to show how complicated and often diffuse and paradoxical these issues are, ironically, it is Russia's presence in Syria which acts as a blockage, a partial blockage, to the expansion of Iran's terrorist activity by itself and by its proxies. I'm not making, of course, light of the dangers relating to Ukraine, or rather to Russia, but there have been so many unexpected developments already, but I want to put things in proportion. Possible, hopefully avoidable occurrences on the one hand, on the Russian front, and very real facts and developments on the other, namely the Iranian threat. The threat of nuclear terrorism, like any terrorism, is twofold. The direct results of terror acts themselves and the political or otherwise results of the mere threat of terrorism. And in the Middle East, we have seen both. Acts of terror by the world's main perpetrator, promoter, and founder of terrorism. Guy Roberts speaks about the potential of terrorist organizations becoming nuclear But the biggest terrorist organization today in the world is actually Iran. And this threat would incalculably increase if Iran were permitted to become a nuclear power. The very fact that as a result of a renewed, probably weakened JCPOA, now apparently close to finalization, at least reading the newspapers, making it clear that Iran was on the way, and not a long way, towards having several nuclear weapons, several nuclear bombs, in addition to being given a free hand financially, will lead to an upsurge of terrorist activities by Iran itself, by its proxies, which Guy Roberts mentioned, in Lebanon, Iraq, Yemen, and the Gaza Strip, and possibly, eventually, also Europe and other parts of the world, and give Iran additional ammunition to fulfill its hegemonic ambitions in parts of the Middle East, stretching all the way from its own country to the shores of the Mediterranean and Lebanon. These are, in our eyes, the real international dimensions, as the captions of this forum put it. General Kenneth McKenzie, commander of U.S. Central Command, former commander of the command, has stated just recently that its concern was, first of all, that Iran doesn't have a nuclear weapon. But he said, I'm quoting, I am also concerned about the growth of their ballistic missile program, which he described as the greatest threat to the region's security because, I quote again, Iran has developed an arsenal of nuclear warhead-capable ballistic missiles. The diplomacy of the Biden administration will not, unfortunately, obstruct Iran's path to nuclear weapons, but it does offer the illusion of a temporary respite, nor does it tackle any of the other aggressive designs of Iran. On the contrary, it abets them. If proof were needed, the demand of Iran, apparently rumored, agreed to by the US to cancel the Iranian Revolutionary Guard's classification as a terrorist organization, though its fingerprints are on all terrorist acts since the outrage decades ago in Argentina, shows that Iran is so sure of itself that it doesn't even try to obfuscate its intentions. There's growing opposition in the US Congress on both sides of the aisle to the agreement or to parts of the agreement, but the administration seems to be determined to conclude it anyway. Don't misunderstand me. I do not for a minute doubt the administration's aim to prevent Iran from obtaining nuclear weapons. It suffices to read my friend William Burns, the CIA director's statement to the House Intelligence Committee, saying, regardless of the outcome of the nuclear negotiations in Vienna, Iran will continue to present a threat throughout the Middle East. And there was a similar quotation by Secretary Blinken himself. To renew the Iran nuclear agreement has been, I think, the alpha and the omega of the Biden administration and even of the Biden electoral campaign all along. It seems almost at any cost, which is clear, at least, this is understood at least, like that by the Iranians. And though the American administration sincerely believes that in due course there can be changes and improvements in the deal, There's nothing in the proposed agreement which would force or even induce the Iranians to agree to eventually add to it the long-term aims which the US has been talking about, or to extend it beyond the span of a very few years. By the way, coming back to the very interesting introduction by Guy Roberts, Henry Kissinger has recently written that he thinks that the threat of artificial intelligence in war is probably more serious even than the nuclear threat, especially as it can be coupled with the nuclear threat. The nations in our region, anyway, coming back to what I said, cannot accept the logic of a better agreement later on once we have signed the present agreement. And the conference 2 days ago between the leaders of Egypt, Israel, and the United Emirates in Sharm el-Sheikh in Sinai, tuned in probably by Jordan and Saudi Arabia, may be seen as putting a significant marker on coordinating positions towards the forthcoming agreement in Vienna. Israel has already declared that it will not abide or be bound by the agreement, and particularly that it will continue to regard the Iranian Revolutionary Guard as the terrorist organization it is, nor are military options off the table. For Israel, of course, my friends, I think Yona also mentioned that indirectly. There's a special reason. This being the first time since Nazi Germany that the state and the regime declare openly their intention to destroy the Jewish people and its state. This common front among our Arab neighbors and Israel would not have been imaginable just a few years ago. It is a direct result of the Abraham Accords pursued by Israel's previous government and very much helped along by the Trump administration. As the COVID continues to prove, we are still one world. We are still one globe. Even if China and Russia want to set up a new world order, the same goes for the pandemic of terrorism. No one can be isolated from its repercussions or its results, not Europe, ultimately not the US. Even if some actors in America think that their country can withdraw from the world, it can't. And as leader of the free world, and we look to it as the leader of the free world, it is a role it cannot evade, which, by the way, also the energy crisis shows today, or the food crisis of today and tomorrow will show. Sooner or later, this is my hopeful wish, hopefully sooner rather than later, America will come to face the imperative of combating terrorism everywhere, certainly Iranian terrorism. That is the optimistic note on which I conclude my remarks. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Chauval. As I mentioned, we'll come back to you after the other colleagues have the opportunity to make their presentation. At this time, I would like to invite our colleague, Peter Rudik, and his, I think, formal title is Assistant Law Librarian of the Congress for Legal Research. And he contributed to our work over the years, and he actually served in Russia at the time as an academic, also legal advisor to the Russian parliament, and then he immigrated to the United States, was educated in the US, and as I mentioned, participated in many of our forums previously. Peter?
Thank you, Professor Alexandra, for your introduction. And let me start with required disassociation from the government, because I'm the only federal employee on this panel. So everything what I will speak today is my own, and it doesn't represent the position of the Library of Congress. When 2 weeks ago you invited me to participate in this conversation about the possibility of using nuclear arms in Ukraine, this sounded like a hypothetical question. And I agreed, thinking and hoping that by the time of this discussion, war in Ukraine will be stopped and there will be no threat of using non-conventional weapons. I was wrong. The war continues, and it looks like it won't stop at any time soon. Even worse, more scholars admit that the probability of using nuclear weapons exists and became even more risky. Today, the New York Times reported that the special team was created at the White House to assess potential risks of using WMDs by the Russians. The first who called attention to this problem was Fiona Hill. In her excellent interview with Politico last month, when asked how far can Putin go in his pursuit, she said, would he use it? Yes, he would. And she repeated this, yes, he would, throughout her interview. Fiona Hill said Putin is increasingly operating emotionally and likely to use the weapons at his disposal, including nuclear ones. It is important not to have any illusions. Earlier this week, Kremlin spokesperson didn't exclude such a development in his interview with CNN. Official propaganda persons justify the use of tactical nuclear weapons also. What is even more dangerous? It appears that Russian leadership started to believe its own propaganda stories. According to an estimate recently published by the Medusa Information Agency, Russia has around 600 non-strategic nuclear military units. However, some experts assess this arsenal in the range of between 1,000 and 2,000 of units. Being a legal analyst, I decided to look at what are the legal mechanisms regulating the use of nuclear arms in Russia. From the international law perspective, there is not much regulation. Russia is a party to the 1968 Non-Proliferation Treaty. It strongly opposes the Treaty on Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, and many disarmament agreements either expired or not address non-strategic arms. The main domestic law in this field is the federal law on the usage of nuclear power, adopted in 1995. This is clearly a post-Chernobyl law and provides for measures aimed at strengthening control, preventing security violations, protecting victims of nuclear accidents. It regulates the use of arms to some degree, but says that it should be done for peaceful purposes. As protection measures, the law creates a regime for access to areas where arms or sources of nuclear power are stored and prohibits to conduct mass gathering or public events near such facilities. Regarding the division of power between branches of government, this law says that all decision-making, or almost all decision-making, is delegated to the president. While jurisdiction of the cabinet of ministers, local administrations, and the legislature is prescribed by the law, all these appear to be nominal, and all decisions in this field are made really by the head of state exclusively. In summer of 2020, the president of Russia issued a decree titled On Fundamentals of the State Policy in the Field of Nuclear Deterrence. It said that the goal of deploying nuclear arms is to prevent escalation of military actions and termination of war against Russia on conditions favored by the Russian Federation. It doesn't say whether this should be a hot or cold war and what constitutes escalation. This idea follows the concept of nuclear de-escalation of a conflict, or in other words, escalation for de-escalation, which was formally established in 2017 in the fundamentals of their naval policy, which should be extended through 2030. Experts say that this concept was used by the Russian military for the last 10 or 12 years. This is, I think, a dangerous idea because it provides for demonstrating the decisiveness to use nuclear arms in a military conflict and deter attacks against Russia. Something similar was recently expressed by the Estonian legislature when it passed its own resolution calling for NATO to close sky over Ukraine. To me, it seems doubtful that if two parties fighting each other would escalate the conflict, these efforts would eventually lead to a peaceful resolution. The 2020 doctrine justified the use of nuclear weapons by Russia in cases when the existence of the state is at risk. Again, this is a very vague definition, and there is no mechanism to assess what brings risk to the existential level. The document states that nuclear arms can be used even against states which don't have nuclear weapons, if the states have a significant general military potential. The list of threats that can be responded by nuclear arms includes uncontrolled proliferation of nuclear technologies and equipment, possession of WMDs that can be used against Russia by a foreign state, transporting military arsenals and nukes delivery equipment to neighboring states, and even deployment of missile defense, unmanned aerial vehicles, and high-precision non-nuclear weapons that can attack Russian forces on the territory or of those states which view Russia as a potential enemy. Since Putin's decree justifies the use of nuclear arms even when enemy's actions may affect critical Russian state or military infrastructure and potentially incapacitate its strategic defense forces. Nothing says that this action must be military. It is interesting that just a few days before the invasion in Ukraine, Russia conducted an exercise of its forces of strategic deterrence. This included launches of varied missiles and review of readiness for strategic nuclear forces. It was the first time when media were informed about this type of exercise in all details by the Ministry of Defense. The Defense Ministry disclosed the type of weapons used in this exercise and locations where these launches were conducted. Also, on the third day of war in Ukraine, Putin ordered to move strategic nuclear forces to something he called the special regime of readiness. Explaining this order on national TV, he said that this was done because leaders of the NATO countries keep making aggressive statements against Russia. He also mentioned Western economic sanctions as another reason for heightening the level of nuclear preparedness. Analysts were puzzled what this special regime means, because this definition was never used before and is not included in the system of alert levels. Some call it here high alert status, but this is not really a high alert and something truly unknown and not defined in these documents. Today, Russian State Information Agency TASS published a statement made by the head of the Russian delegation at the peace negotiations with Ukraine, where he said that the whole existence of the country is under threat now, and the goal of the Western world is to destroy Russia completely. Did it happen by accident that these words were said on the day of the NATO summit? Russian military expert Pavel Luzin believes that in the current situation, Russian leadership considers the use of nuclear arms as a possible option. That is why he believes that in this situation, a lot depends on individuals involved in the process and on the so-called human factor. What will be the consequences of such actions? It is difficult to forecast. Does the Russian leader understand where he can lead? Is this threat imminent? I don't know. Some believe that economic sanctions will undermine Russia's ability to respond, and every day of war weakens Putin's regime. Others count on strong civic resistance across the Western world. Third, rely on military dominance. Which solution will be proven correct? I don't know, but I can say and echo what Mr. Roberts said today, that existing legal framework doesn't appear to be a well-working mechanism in the current situation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter, for your presentation. Obviously, you raised some very important issues. We'll come back to you. Perhaps you can clarify for us how do you see the mind of President Putin in regard to future action in the WMD area. We would like to move on now with our next colleague, Major General Dr. Mikhail Nunesco. As I mentioned before, he served not only in the academic area, but also at the Romanian Ministry of National Defense and worked with NATO. And he contributed to our work and studies over the years. Mikhail?
Thank you so much for giving me the floor, Mr. Jonach. Thank you so much for your invitation at this very informative conference. I have heard a lot and I have learned a lot, especially concerning the Middle East. Is for me a surprise what Mr. Chauvel said about the development in the area, and there are very, very interesting from that point of view, the connection which we can draw from the evolution in this region and also with the Ukrainian crisis. Well, when I have received the kind invitation of Mr. Jonach to attend and to be a speaker at this meeting, I didn't imagine that soon I would be involved in discovering, in a process of discovering the truth which had been highlighted here by Mr. Guy Roberts, saying that we are, Mr. Chauvel, sorry, said, we are one globe. Mr. Roberts said another thing, that it's a little respect, or no respect, I would say, of the international norms today. Because I have been in the process of discovering that even if Romania, which is a neighbor of Ukraine, having a border with Ukraine of about 1,000 kilometers, 900 and something, you know. And all of a sudden, after the beginning of the invasion of Russia, all of a sudden, Romania and Romanians had been deeply involved in the evolution of this war. And I would try to explain to you that kind of facts because it's connected with that nuclear terrorism, which is very rapidly developing in our world. Firstly, in one of my first points, I had the intention to highlight the fact that the operational plans of the Russian army had failed in the first plan, had failed in the first 2 days, a kind of blitzkrieg in which the Russians would be welcomed like the liberators in Ukraine. And after that, they have changed immediately the plans, but operation is that kind of plans are something new, which had developed a kind of war in Europe, which have not been on such a scale since the Second World War, in terms of the death of civilians, in terms of destroying the cities, and also in terms of how the Russian invading army is operating against great cities of Ukraine. That first point is that they are using these tactics, I would say, to encircle the great city of Ukraine in order to, like during the medieval ages, like the fortress during the medieval ages, and after that, cutting all the ways to give the provisions, electricity, water, food, so and so on, to the population, accepting a kind of humanitarian corridors for evacuating the civilians, but also bombing these humanitarian corridors and inflating in such a way the number of victims and the number of civilians, which is a kind of war crimes, not a kind, really war crimes. And at the same time, at this point, I have tried to figure out what means this culminazione point, which is, how to say, in the Russian doctrine, which Mr. Rudik had presented to us, the point in which the offensive is on equal foot with the defensive, and which General Hodge, together with the eminent strategist Lindley French, said recently that around the 15th of March had been reached. And now it's up to Russia to decide if they would opt for a protracted war or they would make an armistice or they would make peace. Several days after, the same Lindley French had come back with the text saying that it's not necessary to give up to the blackmail, nuclear blackmail of Russia, and that the West would have to support extensively Ukraine in order to overcome this culminazione point and at the same time to win that war. Secondly, I would have discovered that what had been the belief, a very robust belief within the public, the world public opinion, of considering the nuclear war like impossible to be waged, because would be the end of the world, would be a calamity for the humanity and things like that, had been eroded since the beginning of the invasion war in Ukraine. Due to the fact that 3 days after the invasion, when the Putin began the new plan of encircling the cities and so on, he raised the alert of its nuclear weapons, and at the same time, that means that nuclear weapons could be used. More than that, and here I am approaching to share with you some of my impression concerning Romania's being close to the war theater. Alongside with this raising the alert of its nuclear forces, the Russian forces in Ukraine began to attack Chernobyl, Zaporozhye, and other nuclear plants, and especially Zaporozhye. And here it's very important to share with you some information about that. At the beginning of March, when Zaporozhye had been attacked and had been fired at the place in Zaporozhye, in Romania had intervened a huge panic among the population. All the pharmacies in Romania had been emptied of iodine pills in order to, how to say, to protect against the radiation. At the same time, a lot of Romanians, according to some polls, there are about between 30 and 40% are considering to leave the country, being afraid of such kind of Chernobyl syndrome. We have experienced in 1986 also another nuclear implosion in Chernobyl, and Romania being close to the Chernobyl from that point of view, anyway, closer than the United States of America or West Europe, a lot of people also used these iodine pills in order to protect themselves and their families. But at the time, we have not been informed about the explosions. It was a hidden secret of Russia, Soviet Russia, and also of the communist regime in Eastern Europe. So only whispers among ourselves had helped us to realize what had happened there and what to do. At the beginning, personally, I have considered that it's a lack of patriotism, the fact that a lot of Romanians had accepted to leave the country and not to stay to defend if we would be attacked by the Russians. And finally, I have realized that it was another motive of such an attitude of a lot of Romanians concerning their desire to protect themselves and their families and to leave the country in order to avoid what would have been the result, the consequences of Zaporozhye conquered by the Russians. Yesterday had appeared in the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists an article in which it was presented a simulation of what would have happened if one of the 5 reactors, nuclear reactors of Zaporozhye would have imploded, would blow up. And the simulation had demonstrated in connection with also with the winds and the weather conditions at those days and all the days after the Russian attack on, that up to now almost 5 million Romanians would have been forced to leave the country. It's amazingly, and I have been astonished by the fact that the community, the public opinion in the country, the whispers among themselves and so on and so forth, had realized the danger, absolutely the threat, the mortal threat which such kind of illegal act of war to attack a nuclear, and it was not only one, it was also Chernobyl and also another one in Kharkov and so on and so forth. So this is a fact which is proving that there are necessary, as Mr. Gay Roberts said, a lot of new rules in terms of protecting such kind of nuclear plants, not only to avoid being stolen by the terrorist group and in such a way creating a havoc in the system, but also to avoid creating a turbulence in the system which would be close to a global conflagration. Also, another point which I would like to present in front of you is that the impact of the Ukrainian crisis had been very low on the Romanian society up to the moment when Putin had raised the alert of its nuclear forces. So this is indicative for the fact that an entire nation could become threatened when such kind of measures, which could be considered in light of the doctrines, as Mr. Rudik said about the Russian doctrines of using nuclear forces, could be considered like being legally. But they are creating outside the country, outside the framework of the system, peaceful or warlike, are creating trends inside the nations which are not part of contradictions between other actors of the international system. Here I am closing to the fact, I am approaching the fact that living in the Westphalian system, in which the energy is a basic law, which means that more than 200 countries are pushing their own legitimate interest, and undoubtedly they are entering in contradictions among this kind of system, which is, how to say, preserving peace only by installing a hegemon or by installing a kind of hegemony, or developing in such a way security, collective security in order to preserve peace and to avoid war a long time, as we have succeeded in doing that after the Second World War up to now, without any global conflagration. That kind of system we would have to think about how to do in order to improve the rules. Again, I am going back to Mr. Guy Roberts said that the lack of respect for the rules is one of the main threats for the community of nations today, and we would have to restore this belief that it's necessary to command, to lead the system in a way, in such a way so we could exclude a global conflagration. That's the end of my presentation, and I have more, of course, here, including some polls in the Romanian society, which are amazing from the point of view of new ideas, new trends developing in a society in a very short time, 1 or 2 weeks, being closer to a war theater in which it is possible to be used nuclear weapons. They are very interesting, and if you would be interested in such kind of polls and such kind of behaving of a society close to such a kind of nuclear terrorism, I would send my text. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for your presentation, very sober. And the irony, obviously, is that many Ukrainian refugees who planned to find refuge in the neighboring countries, including Romania, now we are discussing how so many Romanians fear a nuclear threat. And with that, we'll come back to you, and we'd like to move to our next speaker, Professor Santa Maria, with the Department of Energy Engineering in Madrid, and also General Secretary of the Institute of Nuclear in the memory of General Velarde. And she will make a PowerPoint presentation which is very comprehensive for our discussion. Nati?
I would like to every good evening to everyone, and I would like to thank you very much, Professor Alexander, for your very kind invitation. I would like to say hello also to Professor Wallace. I'm a pleasure to meeting you again. And I see always Professor Rita in the screen. So hello to everybody. I think we are living very difficult days, and my presentation deals with how the Ukrainian-Russian war is can be considered, in my point of view, as a hybrid threat for the European Union. Please, next slide. As a revision of what all of you know about the hybrid threat, I think we have to start with the psychological factor, which means how people feel helplessness, how people feel traumatic until in front of these events that are every day happening, especially, and I have written next to psychological part of this, is due to disinformation, propaganda, manipulation of information that is intended to change people's attitudes. And sometimes it's very difficult to discriminate whether we are dealing with good information, fake information, and so on. So people feel in the middle without knowing what to do. Plus the problem of economic pressure. As you know, Russia is a very important exporter of gas and natural resources to the European Union, And presently, the market after the problem of the pandemic, the energy source market is becoming a bit chaotic. So prices are increasing, and therefore the conflict of the war in Ukraine, in Russia, Ukraine, contributes to this economic pressure of citizens. Another aspect of the hybrid threat is naturally the deployment of irregular armed forces that can be, for example, we can talk of insurgencies, or we can talk naturally of asymmetric combat approaches, which are intended to erode the adversary power. And finally, naturally, the regular armed forces. In the next slide, we can see as well a summary, very short of very general of hybrid warfare features. So in a hybrid warfare feature, we're going to find actor states versus non-actor states, that is in our minds always the problem of terrorism or extremist ideologies or religious sects and so on. In the middle of this, there is always a factor of anonymity, which gives freedom to these non-state actors to act with more impunity. It's important to mention as well that the non-military methods have played a central role in the hybrid warfare. And the last column, the column on the right side, we see that in these hybrid warfare factors, we can use, or they can be used, low-cost methods, and they produce really high-yield results. One of the examples of paradigms could be terrorism. Next slide, please. Okay, hybrid threats is stated in the program of the European Union when a state or non-state actors seek to exploit the vulnerabilities of the European Union by using coordinated way of mixture of measures, diplomatic, military, economic, etc. Remaining below the threshold of formal warfare. Examples, according to the European Union document, are the hindering of democratic decision-making process by massive disinformation, using social media to control the political narrative, or even to radicalize or recruit indirect proxy actors. In proxy actors, we can include naturally organized crime, we can include terrorists, or we can include even hacker groups that have enormous incidents, as at the beginning you said about artificial intelligence and the influence and the role of artificial intelligence. Maybe next slide is right. Well, this is a map in which I have included something that is clear in terms of military and defense. Okay, so we've got to see in the left of map how the European military alliances were developed during the wars in the period of the Cold War, basically up to 1991. When the demise of the Soviet Union was produced, and the Soviet Union was divided into different Commonwealth of independent states. After the years in 2020, European military alliances are mainly in the sector of military protection of NATO. And we can see the evolution of European countries, most of them belonging to the European Union Commonwealth or Commission, as you can see in the map on below. Maybe next slide, which is something I think is very interesting, because from 2006, the nuclear and radiological scientists were gathering in certain workshops that were sponsored by NATO. So in the first, I contribute myself with my research, but it was really an extremely fruitful experience, because in that period, 2006, 2007, 2008, and afterwards the last one, prevention, detection, and response, was in 2014. So all these works accumulated the best of the research done in terms of prevention, detection of, and response of nuclear terrorism. All this finished, if you wish, in the publication on this wonderful, this excellent book edited by Professor Alexander and Dr. Rosen, in which they explain by different authors the different aspects of NATO, as the title of the book says, from regional to global security provider. And when I studied the book, for example, in the chapter 10, there is a very comprehensive chapter, which is Ukraine and other unfinished businesses. Is published by Dr. Patrick Murphy, is in the book of NATO. I think that this describes rather well the situation in that in parallel were going on Ukraine and the NATO alliance. Next slide, please. I go to the core of the present situation. On March 4th, General Director Rafael Mariano Grossi, General Director of the International Atomic Energy Agency, made an urgent and immediate call of the United Nations Security Council to talk about the Russian attack to some nuclear power plant in Ukraine. So Mr. Grossi, Dr. Grossi, was there explaining to the Council of the United Nations the situation of urgency that have come due to the strike of Russian troops to this nuclear power plant. So in the next slide, we can see, how this is the Ukrainian Atomic Energy Commission, that Ukraine has a very solid nuclear program in terms of especially nuclear energy development. We can say that presently Ukraine gets almost 50% of their electricity coming from the 4 nuclear power stations, power plants that we are going to see in the next slide. But before, let me tell you how active, for example, is this website of the Ukrainian Atomic Commission in 2021 with different public media communications, users, page views of the site, analytics, photo reports. As you have seen over there, there is a very wide information of the nuclear infrastructure in Ukraine. And for example, in the exclusion zone, which is on the top part, you can read perfectly how after Chernobyl accident and closing of the nuclear power plant in Kiev, the exclusion zone was established, and you can see the development, which are working presently to shut down the central power plant for 2028. Finish the works on the decommission of this nuclear power plant. In the bottom, we can have free access to International Atomic Energy Commission agency radiation protection posters, in which people can find all the reports published by the International Atomic Energy Agency or medicine on radiological procedures, on research in industry, radiological protection, and so on. Please, this slide, we will see the different power plants that and the distances that are presently in Ukraine. The four main ones is as you can see in the map. I don't have my pointer, but I think they are in English as well written, so no problem. The biggest one and the biggest of Europe is Zaporizhzhia. Is not only the biggest power plant in Ukraine, but it's also the biggest power plant in Europe with 4 power units. Okay, the type of reactors used in the whole energy power plants in Ukraine are known in the West as pressurized water reactors, and in Russian VVEC, according to the Russian acronym. Well, Zaporizhzhia is exactly as you can see there, the biggest one. Afterwards, we've got maybe if we go to the next slide, we can see the aspects of the 4 main power plants in Ukraine, which are really very solid, very solid installations. They started at the end of the 70s. 1977 started the main power plants in Ukraine, and they were growing up according to the energy demand of the Ukrainian people. You've got, for example, the second one, Chmelnytskaya. It has 2 power units. Or Rivne, it has 4 power units. Zaporizhzhia, we have said that it's 6 power units. And finally, in South Ukraine, we will have 3 power units. In total, we've got 15 reactors working for the production of electricity in the country. Next slide, please. So, all of us were worried, all of us were shocked when we heard that on March 4th, the Russian forces struck the part in a wall of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. And this is a map published by Statista, in which they, as you can read on the bottom left, occupied by Russian forces, a part of the eastern part of the country, and the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, which is presently under Russian army control. Members of the Russian Atomic Energy Commission of the Minatom please next slide as well. So after this attack, this strike on March the 4th, all of us were very, very worried. And for this reason, General Director Mario Grossi appeared publicly to speak about the situation in Ukraine, and they decided naturally immediately to put in full response activation the Incidents and Emergency Center, which is part of the International Atomic Energy Agency and is in charge of the supervision and to make a follow-up in real time of any action, of any event that is happening in real time. In the next slide, we can see the different updates made by International Atomic Energy Agency from the very first moment. As I said, I have written in different colors, literally the information given, sorry, excuse me, by the International Atomic Energy Agency, because it's the information that has to be trusted, okay? I read newspapers, naturally, I read journals, naturally, but excuse me, I really, I trust more than anybody else the information, the official information given by this official organism, depending on the United Nations. Therefore, the first one explains what happened. They say that they continued operating the plant and so on. In March 19, the Russian Federation reported to the International Atomic Energy Agency that the situation was completely stabilized. On March the 20th, General Director says that the nuclear power plants were operative, and that the radiation level, which was something that media has explained very bad, and that makes people to be frightening, said that all of them were working in normal range. It's true, and it's very important to remark that when you are working in a nuclear facility, you need people working there need a stability, both emotional and physical, and this is something that unfortunately in these cases have been missed in Chernobyl and in the rest in Zaporizhzhia. So what the General Director says, that operating staff must be able to fulfill one of the pillars of energy safety. One of the pillars of energy security is that people have really an equilibrium, a balance to make good the decisions and so on, and not work under pressure. Next slide, please. Well, this is the Nuclear Regulatory Inspectorate in Ukraine that sent a message, an official message on March 18, telling that the operating monitoring personnel were working. There are no change in the radiological situation have been registered, and that the last report was that representative of the State Atomic Energy Corporation of the Russian Federation, Rosatom, are still present at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant site. I think the next slide tell us well that from 2008, Ukrainian has developed an important counter-nuclear terrorism program. I remember I met Dr. Makarovska in Armenia in our first meeting with NATO in 2006, and I have had with General Velarde, which is not with us, of sharing a lot of meetings, a lot of conversations with high-level experts in nuclear security. And for example, the Ukrainian government from 2008, according to the Ministry of Fuel and Energy, reported that analysis of available threat assessment data demonstrates that potentially hazardous nuclear energy facilities are among the most likely targets of terrorist attacks. Ukrainian government has under their capacities several organisms, several institutes, security, state ministry, Ministry of Interior, state nuclear regulatory inspectorate, state nuclear regulatory, and so on, because we cannot forget, according to radioactive sources, that Ukraine has got more than 3,500 radioactive sources for different uses, right? For medical uses, for industrial uses, for agriculture uses, and so on. For this reason, it's very important to take into consideration as well, not only the nuclear power plants, but as well the control of the radioactive sources that could be applied potentially in a dirty bomb or a radiological dispersion device. And yes, it's the last one, the risk assessment. The next one is the last one. The next slide is, yeah, thank you. The risk assessment made by the General Director, Dr. Grossi, which is for me very impacting, is very impacting. We see what is happening on the ground in Ukraine. This time, if there is a nuclear accident, the cause will not be a tsunami brought on by nature. Instead, it will be the result of human failure to act when we knew we could and when we knew we should. Thank you very much. In my next slide, I tell openly, thank you very much for your attention. It has been for me, as always, a pleasure to be here. And thank you very much, Jonas, Professor Alexander, for your invitation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your very comprehensive overview. And the risk is really increasing, not only in terms of Russia using some nuclear capability, but here even to attack this nuclear power plants in the Ukraine. We'll come back to you, but to look at another perspective in terms of biological threats, and I would like to invite our colleague, Professor Rita Caldwell, who is the university professor at Maryland Johns Hopkins University, as I mentioned before, senior fellow at the Potomac Institute. She is one of the key, I would say, scientists focusing on these issues for many years. Also, their work in public service, director of National Science Foundation, and many of the advisory positions, U.S. government and nonprofit science policy organization, and so on and so forth. And we're very grateful that you could join us at this time again. And we would like to ask you to share some of your thinking about also the biological threats, both Mother Nature and man-made. Rita?
Thank you very much, Yona, for the opportunity to make a commentary. I have not prepared a presentation except to point out that we focused this afternoon on nuclear weapons, but in general, we have to consider weapons of mass destruction, which means biological and chemical, as well as the underlying force of extremism and contributing factors for terrorism of all forms. The introduction by Guy Roberts was extremely illuminating, particularly of the large numbers of incidences of radioactivity being employed either accidentally or directly. But what I would like to, and he also pointed out that there's no wide database worldwide for the sort of inventory of radio or nuclear facilities. Similarly, there really is no database on bio laboratories or chemical laboratories that have engaged in forms of extremism. There have been incidences, and these have been recorded, but not as a data per se. Fortunately, a Tiger team on weapons of mass destruction has been formed by President Biden, but I feel that it might be a bit of the horse having long left the barn. We really have to consider all facets of terrorism that are now available, weapons of mass destruction of all types, and particularly with a lack of respect for the rule of law, we have to assume that Putin will actually progress from the traditional warfare, which has not been conducted effectively by him and his team, to very likely the next step will be chemical, or perhaps chemical biological as a psychological weapon before proceeding to the ultimate threat and action of a nuclear weapon. There have been recently published in the last day or so complete details of the actual use of chemical weapons by Putin and his, I'll say his thugs in using toxins and toxic agents to eliminate dissenters and competitors. This, of course, was carried out in the UK, and it is a demonstration of the chemical biological weapon brandishing by Putin. So we can probably expect, particularly since the intelligence does seem to indicate that Putin is preparing to use chemical weapons by the usual cover that he employs to claim that the US and NATO are in the process of employing such weapons when it is not really true. Nevertheless, it's, I think, necessary to address terrorism in all forms. And very likely, biological threats will be carried out on food supplies because it'll be insidious. We already have seen, because of the shortages that have come up because of the insufficiency of being able to distribute food effectively and widely, that use of biological agents can further disrupt and make very effective weapons that can be done insidiously without a direct intrusion or intervention. So my comments are very brief. It's simply that indeed we have to consider all of the weapons of mass destruction, with very likely, which has been discussed extremely well in detail and very effectively this afternoon, the nuclear threat. But the path to the nuclear weapon being deployed very likely will be a chemical and biological path taken by Putin, and that we should be alerted to this potential and be aware. And then finally, one comment is that extremism, which leads to terrorism, threatens all countries. And this is at a time when we find that forms of extremism are thriving in this general atmosphere of a lack of respect for the rules of law, as was pointed out earlier today. And so it, I think, is important for us to collectively be addressing extremism and its ultimate form in terrorism. So those are my very brief remarks, since this is a focus on nuclear threats, and it's been extremely well presented by experts here today. So thank you, Yona, for an opportunity to make a few comments.
Thank you very much, Rita, again. And obviously, we learned from many of your publications as to what works and what doesn't work, and hopefully we can find some countermeasures that will reduce the risk. Now, in the interest of time, I would like to turn back to our colleagues, the speakers, and ask them if they would like to make a comment in addition to their own presentation, and then develop some Q&A discussion. I would like to ask first Guy Roberts, any additional comments from you?
Well, I think I tried to give a overall perspective, and again, voice my concerns about the need for like-minded, law-abiding nations to reaffirm their commitments to the international legal order that is so wantonly been violated by Russia, and that there needs to be costs to be paid for those violations. And President Putin and his colleagues need to be held accountable. And especially at risk is the so-called nuclear taboo of using nuclear weapons. And if for any reason that should be breached, then we are in a whole new arena of unknown political consequences of breaking that taboo and breaking the barrier on the use of nuclear weapons, which we have said over and over again. A nuclear war should never be fought and cannot ever be won. And for us to be faced with that calamity, I frankly would never have believed it. But we have one man who's basically turned everything on its head, and the consequences is proliferation and the greater potential, coupled with all of the other new technologies, the greater potential that state-sponsored and even non-state-sponsored groups may acquire this capability. And it is a very challenging and somewhat frightening world that we face. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Guy. Ambassador Chauvel, any additional comments or questions?
Well, very briefly, also referring to the presentation of Professor Caldwell, of course, she's right. It's not only nuclear. I mentioned artificial intelligence before. We didn't talk about cyber, and definitely it is the risk or the threat of chemical or biological warfare. I just want to remind ourselves that the only two countries which have already used chemical weapons were Iran in its war against Iraq and Syria in the wars of the internal wars of the last several years. I thought, of course, it's only natural, and I would say self-explanatory, that the main emphasis today, certainly in this forum, was on Ukraine. But I must stress again that we are talking about a possible situation, hopefully avoidable, with all the needs to employ direct sanctions and rules of law and so on and so forth. But we're actually facing already a major terrorist entity called Iran, with its proxy organizations in the Middle East and elsewhere, in Africa too, who threatened to develop a nuclear weapon by international agreement without any concrete limitations, except perhaps a certain time lag of very few years. And Iran is already today a nuclear threshold state. So for Israel's point of view, of course, everybody looks closely to its own interests. I'm not saying that Ukraine is not very important to us. It is for different reasons. By the way, it's not so far away from us, although we are the Middle East, and that's Eastern Europe or Southern Europe, but it's not so very far away from us. But Syria is closer. And therefore, of course, we look at it somehow in a different perspective. All this doesn't in any way imply that the civilized world, led by the United States, should not make a major effort to stop any possibility of nuclear, of use of nuclear weapons, tactical or not. In military terms, we know that strategy is no more than an assemblage of tactics. So what's tactical today can very easily become tomorrow strategic. All consequences of that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Chauvel. I will turn to Peter Rudik. I meant to ask you about the so-called Putin mind puzzle that some compare it to the doctrines of Mein Kampf, for example, and perhaps he was influenced by Alexander Dugin in terms of the right wing, the new right wing approach. Any comments on that or any other?
Well, I don't know what is in Putin's head, but I can say what Russian observers mention about this. And they see that, and they are afraid that the Kremlin believes that it can control escalation at every level, and that Kremlin can dictate its demands at every stage of the conflict. According to them, it happens now because there is no direct contact between Putin and his military commanders, because there is a distrust between highest level leadership and military For example, we didn't see the Minister of Defense for almost 2 weeks on TV. And they believe that human factor can be the major factor in preventing the possibility of nuclear attack because of so many different stages and levels and institutions involved in the process of implementing the orders. Probably somebody will just refuse to do it. But again, there are other mechanisms which may work on the side of those who are interested in pushing the button. So it's really, really uncertain. Talking about Putin's head, we can remember probably it became now often cited his first public interview when he ran for the office first time in the early 2000. And he mentioned how being a teenager, he was chasing a rat in his apartment and this rat jumped at him because it was cornered. And he said that it is his major lesson in life not to be cornered and never give up and fight until the last minute. So who knows? But I still believe that like every war which gives us a new opportunity to develop a legal framework and answer new legal challenges. For example, after World War II, we got international tribunals. After Balkan Wars, we got new model of governance and organizing the judiciary. Probably this war will also give us some models for organizing international security, because for 30 years we were proudly saying that the Soviet Union dissolved without bloodletting. Now we are witnessing a war which is aimed at redrawing borders of the former Soviet Union. And I believe that new security systems should be established and probably will be established after this war. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Peter. General Nesco, please.
Well, during, preparing my text and thinking about, I have been amazed by two facts. Firstly, how fast had been the process of erosion of the belief that the nuclear war wouldn't be possible. I have read a lot of comments on different articles in the international press, in the national press, and so on and so forth. In several days, I have realized that all of a sudden something is moving from one point to another, from the firm belief that the nuclear war couldn't be won, up to the normalcy of a nuclear war. This is the first fact. Firstly, I have considered that it's a kind of, imperial mentality, when the comments were something like, if it would be necessary to use nuclear bombs in order to stop Putin or another madman, we would have to do it. But afterwards, I have realized that it's not only this kind of imperial mentality, because also there are such comments also in a small country without any imperial tradition and things like that. Secondly, the second point is that I realized also that it's absolutely necessary that hopefully after we would end up this very, tension period in the life of our international system, when everything would be solved, hopefully peacefully, or in a way or another. We would have to bring together the best diplomats to find out more Kissingers, I would say, in order to think about what to do next in order to avoid such kind of things. Because I have observed, reading different articles, that we are not accommodating ourselves with facts which are well known only to the experts. I would give you some examples. the experts in nuclear field have a lot of scenarios how to be used the so-called small arms, nuclear arms, how to use the tactical weapons, nuclear weapons. And they are giving a lot of scenarios, which I am thinking myself, if not Putin have read that or have been informed about, and perhaps he would, how to say, would blackmail us, for example, bombing a part of the Black Sea, killing only the fish inside the water, in order to how to say, to make us to capitulate, to surrender, to accept whatever he would like to do. So we would have to bring people at the end of that who knows a lot about that kind of things, about the equilibrium, about the way in which the system had been, had functioned along the eras, along the recent, especially during the atomic era, after the Second World War, after the post-Cold War, including the specialists in intelligence, the artificial AI, in artificial intelligence, because I have, I would agree with what the ambassador said, that perhaps it's Kissinger said, as a matter of fact, that it's perhaps most dangerous than the nuclear weapons. So that kind of thing, so you would have to instill, how to say, not only the respect for the rules, for the international rules, but also to carry out a kind of international rules which would be accepted worldwide.
Thank you very much. In the interest of time, we would like to ask Professor Santa Maria briefly for your comment, because we the clock is ticking and we would have to close and call upon General Gray to make some closing comments.
Very briefly, I think that history is a cyclic period. I think it's not linear. Therefore, I remember the missile crisis in 1962, excuse me, when it was discovered that the Soviet platforms were installing in Cuba to launching platforms for rockets. Well, they started an escalation of tensions around the world between both blocs, and naturally Europe in the middle, Warsaw Pact and NATO. At the end of everybody saw that this only could lead to a mutual assured destruction. Therefore, I think that we should, as Professor Alexander says, to learn lessons from the past and try to solve this situation as better as possible, because the use of nuclear weapons is something like a mutual assured destruction that obviously nobody wants. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. General Gray.
I have no real comments. I want to thank all the participants for their very excellent presentations. It's clear that, of course, the nuclear weapons materials and, as a matter of fact, any materials that can do damage, it's always been at least since 1993 that I'm aware of, the terrorist leaders have been talking about trying to get these things. So we have to remain eternally vigilant on this topic and not take anything for granted. And above all, keep the pressure on, keep the intelligence and other operational networks active, and keep this topic very much foremost in everybody's mind. So thank you all very much.
Thank you. Jen, would you like to make a comment?
I would, but we are out of time, so I will defer to the next event, Yona. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Mentioning the next event, we're planning to hold a forum on March 31, focusing on the humanitarian refugee disaster and the implications elsewhere for the future potential to prevent potential genocides, and so on. I would like to thank all the speakers for their most insightful, I think, view, and we would consider this as a guide for continuing our academic work in the future. Thank you very much. Stay safe. All the best.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Goodbye.
All the best.